coming up with Xbox 360, which was basically the first console which transitioned into digital. And I quickly understood there was a huge potential in the new markets at that time. It was a very successful launch. It was the biggest numbers.
Stefan Lampinen, founder of Game Advisor and an expert game strategist who has shaped global initiatives for EA, Microsoft, Nokia and Warner Brothers.
What's the success story behind Sweden? The mindset, for example, Minecraft, they think global from day one. There is a lot of entrepreneurs in Sweden. There is the appetite to take risks, to start something.
Before we dive into it, let's start with who you are, what you do and why.
Yeah, I'm Stefan Lampinen and I've been in games all my life. I started very early when I was 18, where you basically could register a limited company. So I set up my own board game store up in the north of Sweden. And from that, I've been jumping around. It's been a luxury to be in many big, nice companies. And today I have my own advisory business, mostly in digital, but obviously covering the board game sector as well, which I'll get more and more interested in nowadays.
I want to go back to 2005, and we've both worked out in Russia. We've both been out in South Africa, laid a land out there because during that period, you were also going through the process of launching Xbox 360. And there was a lot of different elements to navigate. So yeah, lay out the landscape and how that ultimately led to the work with Sega in Sweden and EA in Europe and further afield.
Sega was obviously 90 to 95 and then Nordic. But if you want to fast forward to 2005, we can start there. I think it was an incredibly interesting time because I was headhunted by Microsoft from Nokia at that time. And Microsoft obviously had a lot of key learning from the first launch of the console and coming up with Xbox 360, which was basically the first console which transitioned into digital, where you had live and DLC. What I like with the Xbox team, they put almost like a global SWAT team of 20 people that thought, what should we do? How should we do it? Because the launch was obviously early December 2005. So you had the best people from logistics, the best people from channel marketing. I was looking into the cross-border accounts of Europe before I went to Russia and all the other markets. And we worked with Samsung on screen. For me, I think it was a very successful launch, Xbox 360. And if I looked at all the articles with the Guardians, it was the biggest numbers. It was perceived very successful as a teamwork, which I like. And I actually found this thing. So we got this from Bill Gates, like I made this. Like on that days, you had this on the top of the Xbox 360. So that was the start of the, let's say, European sales director. But then I quickly understood, and obviously other people as well, that there was a huge potential in the new markets at that time, Poland, Czech, Hungary, Russia. So we created a new region, emerging market, and I was basically in charge of both the MEA, CEE, and Russia from 2006, which meant I spent enormous of time on an airplane, and I got probably one of the best networks in Europe.
And what was it like in those early days? Because as I say, we've both worked out in Russia, we've both been out in South Africa and other developing nations. What was your experience, like some of the stories you'd like to share from that period?
At that time, it was so much about the retail coverage, to have the storefronts, have the collaboration. For example, MediaMarkt was incredibly big at that time. But when you look into Russia, the Xbox 360 launch was delayed a lot for various reasons. Poland was earlier, and there was like a phasing of console launches. One was, for example, the Xbox Live, how to get that to work, because there were a lot of other features coming with the Xbox. With Russia, obviously, from a political point of view, it wasn't the easiest one, having the P&L for Xbox, and then with the Seattle headquarters and everything we had to do there. But we got a fantastic support, obviously, with the local team, but also the product managers in Seattle and Europe. We had 5 P&Ls in EMEA at that time, so it was a huge difference running my region versus, obviously, UK, Germany, France.
Before you got into games, you touched upon Nokia and also the work in and around board games. What first pulled you towards the games industry, and what did it feel like when you first took up some of these roles?
I quickly saw the joy with board games, and there were some friends of me playing board games that been to UK. And when I started that board game store, it was just propelling in sales. People were coming, driving 3-4 hours, even from Finland, to shop, because at that time it was the early days of Games Workshop, Avalon Hill, TSR with the Dungeons and Dragons. And the main supplier in Stockholm at that time saw the volume. So they asked me to come over and set up a board game chain, actually, called Tradition, that was later acquired by Electronic Boutique. And then from that on, we started to do local board games. At that time, I was starting to see that video games was coming up. And I actually wrote to the biggest toy company in the region, Brio, and said, hey, I can help you to get the Sega Mega Drive distribution contract. And the boss of Brio at that time, he thought, oh, that's interesting. Come and visit us. And then eventually Brio got the contract for Sega, coming in as a major underdog to Super Nintendo at that time.
And what about cultural relevance around games around that period of time? Like me personally, I'm like 42 now, and I've been playing games all my life from, I think, the very first Amiga or Commodore 64, right up until where I am now. But the whole ability to shape culture, what did that period teach you, and what was like the breakthrough moment for you in regards to like the cultural relevance in games?
I think Sweden obviously has always been early. We don't dub the language like Germany, France and Spain, etc. So we had a good understanding of English early. We had a connection with UK. For example, Virgin at that time, Virgin Interactive and Virgin Games with the Richard Branson team, they also supported the Nordic region in various ways. So the interest from media, first obviously with Nintendo, and then when we rolled out Mega Drive September 1990, it was a huge media attention, both in radio and TV. We had 70% of the household doing installed base of the video games. When you ask the big names in Sweden, like Fredrik West, Lars Wingefors, Embracer, or Tommy Palm, and all the 40 plus, 45, 50 guys, they've been growing up with Mega Drive or Super Nintendo. So Sweden as a country was very early into the 16-bit, which I think also later led into a lot of early development studios from Sweden. So I would say the barriers was quite low at that time. And you have to remember at that time you had 3 big launches. You always had Japan first, then you wait 6 months or less, even longer at that time for US, and then you had Europe. So it was like a stage or a phasing of how you released game at that time.
Looking at the impact of Sweden today, we see a lot of great content coming up there. Like everybody talks about DICE, having visited there during my EA days. Battlefield and stuff was incredible. Obviously, you built a lot of that out for EA from scratch. You rose to VP and oversaw quite a huge market. What was the most pivotal lesson that you learned from that expansion journey?
I told a few times I was in Japan 2018 and said, what's the success story behind Sweden? And I think there are many reasons. One was obviously Ericsson was big companies like a talent factory, hiring a lot of engineering. We had a government initiative called PC Home. We had a first-class early infrastructure in the market, and also like a sharing is caring collaboration. 2010, for example, a gaming cluster in Skövde started to build up. At that time, it was the biggest development school in Europe, probably 300 people. Now there are 500. The mindset, for example, Minecraft, that was in their advisory board 2010. They always thought, if you look at Paradox and Minecraft, they think global from day one. So there are many reasons. And of course, the early 16-bit installation base, if you compare to some other European countries. And also, I had a call today actually with one of the business coaches in Skövde before this podcast. And he also said, remember also the social welfare in Sweden is very comprehensive safety net. So you can take risks to start your own company. There is a lot of entrepreneurs in Sweden that also own big companies out today. But the appetite to take risk to start something, you can do that in an easier way than you can in some other countries in the world, obviously.
I remember going to Track 20 and stuff over in Helsinki, and I was really encouraged there in regards to the whole environment in and around Helsinki and others about incubators as well, and like small accelerators. And we must remember that from a tech perspective, there's also the early adoption parts. Often the Nordics are utilized as a test bed. And I know in previous conversations and work shared, you've mentioned Netflix and HBO doing international soft launches there. What are your thoughts, I guess, in regards to those pieces and the other advantages that come out of the Nordics?
I think if you look at Finland, I did a big report 2020 about the best gaming cities in the world. If you look into the surrounding of Helsinki, also when Nokia faced challenges, they had a fantastic ecosystem with mentors, they had government loans, also sharing. So if you look into the biggest mobile game companies from Finland, they are coming, many of those guys, from Nokia. So Nokia was in the forefront, so to say, and obviously they could have done things better with Engage. But the learning from mobile in Finland 2003 was amazing. And again, the incentives to start your own company. So I think that's one important thing. In Sweden, there hasn't been EU grants, but there have always been a good infrastructure. You have that in Malmö as well. You have the accelerator, you have the incubator, and so on. So I think that's mostly Sweden and Finland. In the last couple of years, you obviously see a lot of good companies coming up, mainly from Denmark as well.
Reflecting back to Nokia, you were part of the early mobile gaming push, especially before like smartphones. So what did that experience teach you about the importance of timing, the appreciation of risk, and also system and platform thinking?
I was headhunted, I was positively aggressive into Nokia, because after VP sales of EA, I went to Germany. I've been in a few countries where they needed some restructure. Nokia approached me probably end of 2002, early 2003, and said about this idea of a mobile gaming phone. I was a bit shocked, of course, first time when I said, when do we plan to launch this, which I asked when I was hired. So I think a few key learnings was that you need to understand the ecosystem and start early with software. And Nokia did a few mistakes, as we all know, like many other companies coming into the gaming industry. So there were very few people with experience from the gaming sector in Nokia. But also, I think they didn't talk the language. I mean, Microsoft talked a certain language, mobile phones talk a certain language, and EA talked a certain language at that time. So there was a lot of cold winds coming in before the release of Engage. Many good things from Nokia was coming, because Engage launched 4 years before iPhone. So you had the online capability, you had the Bluetooth, you had the landscape playing. But as we all know, changing the game, you need to take out the batteries and stuff like that. Nokia, if they would probably have launched it 2 years later, I think things would have been completely different. And also, if they started with the software support earlier. But there was many good games coming out in Engage. And Spain was a success story for Nokia also, with Telefonica. And in Spain, we had a guy from Sony PlayStation. So I think you need to have the mix of skills and capabilities from various industries.
Yeah, because from a timing perspective, obviously Nokia back in the day were quite a substantial brand and huge amount of reach and influence. And yeah, they were overtaken and surpassed by a lot of other companies. Like, why do you think that happened?
There was a few things with the mobile business. At that time, it was more about have as many models as possible, share the space in the retail, like you had with Super Nintendo and Mega Drive or Xbox 360 and PlayStation, get the space with Dixon, with Fnac, with MediaMarkt, so on. But then also at that time, if you want to have multiplayer as a manufacturer of Nokia, you had to go through the operators or carriers, as they call in the US. You had the Orange, you had the Deutsche Telekom, etc. You had the Telefonica. So the value chain was quite complicated. You have 3 regions. You have the Asia, you have the US, North America, and you have Europe. And you have to go through the phone manufacturing, the hardware, into an operator, and then into the software. And then suddenly the Machiavelli of computers and digital, Steve Jobs, come with the iPhone. And then you have a global market from day one. You have a global platform from day one. And there was a lot of things happening in the industry around, let's say, 2007 up to 2009, 10.
One of the things that I wanted to also note was during my time at EA, we were going through that packaged goods to digital transformation, and there was a lot of push to places like Romania and also to the Asian market. So I spent quite a bit of time in both Eastern Europe and down into Asia as well. One of the things that came across to me being there was also the appreciation about taste preferences. So, you know, if you look at games from a Western taste preference versus an Eastern and go and look specifically about culturalization, localization, there is very distinct taste preferences around the types of games people want to play, the type of experiences that want to come across. Looking back to your time in the emerging markets, what do you feel was the biggest cultural and market challenges, and how did you ultimately overcome them?
There was a blended mix because, for example, Poland was early and very easy. I think Poland actually had the highest Xbox Live players per capita and also a very good board game country. In Turkey, you had luxury tax and you had other kind of taxes. So the console was never launched in Turkey, for example, which is one of the reasons that Turkey is leading the mobile gaming today and PC. So there was a huge blend of factors. Obviously, with Russia, you have other things when it comes to logistics. And if you have to make a return from Russia, you have double VAT and stuff like that. So I think the blend of challenges was probably the beauty of having that region for 4 years. And obviously, so MEA region was consisting mostly of, let's say, Dubai and that region, and Turkey. You had South Africa. I would say the easiest ride was probably more countries like Poland, South Africa, where you have more culture similarities. And then we didn't launch Xbox 360 in some other countries on top of Turkey, of course.
We touched a bit earlier upon the successes in and around the Nordics and Sweden specifically. Do you think there's a possibility for national success models such as the Nordics be replicated in other nations to create a fertile ground to build upon?
I think there are a few, for example, also in Sweden, you've been having a very active trade organization. I was actually happy to be a co-founder in 1998. But for example, the way the Swedish trade organization have worked with international collaboration with Japan is one. And there are similarities between Sweden and Japan, obviously not from an entrepreneur point of view, but when it comes to consensus and culture. When I've been advising, let's say, big Western or US companies or investors, they always, or even big consulting houses in US without mentioning their name, they very often forget Pokemon, which is the most valuable IP. So if you look at Japan, for example, you have Pokemon, you have Nintendo, you have Sega, and so on. And they have, in Japan, they have longevity, simplicity. If you look into how Nintendo is built up, the brand and the IP. And if you look into Sweden, then what we have done from an entrepreneur point of view, social security net, the government initiative, which is more like infrastructure rather than money. And then look into the Swedish success of games, Minecraft, longevity, simplicity, brand IP, Paradox, longevity. The number of players that keep playing Paradox games are incredible. You have that with King. So if you look into many of the Swedish successful game companies, you're starting to see some similarities with Japan. I haven't been to Korea, but I think that's a region which is coming obviously more. With Saudi, I've been skeptical to esport because the economic model is not sustainable and the demand from players or the spending from players isn't enough. Now esport is changing, and countries like Saudi have no private equity, they have no VCs, they have no stress, they're not IPO, they're not on the stock market. So esport is looking very interesting now coming into the market. And then we can talk about trends later. You have new concept like even like competition play to. But I think what's happening with grants, Montreal was built of fantastic grants when Ubisoft moved in to put up the biggest studio in Montreal in Canada. So many European countries have EU grants today, but I don't think that's the key. The key is basically the structure. And I'm very impressed with UK, honestly. If you look into AI, what's happening in Cambridge, for example, the leading hub in Europe, I would say. If you look into UK, it's not only London, you have Midlands, you have the Game Republic, you have the BAFTA. So there is a lot of infrastructure. I think in UK, the independent companies haven't come into that spotlight for various reasons, mainly probably because you have so many other big companies in UK like Jagex and so on.
Yeah, I think from a UK perspective, one of the companies that I'm really always enamored by is Rebellion. Obviously, they had a fall not too long ago, but it's also the publishing arm that they got behind that in regards to, if you look to cross-pollinate content, they have a breadth of comics and those types of publications that fall under their publishing arm. So, yeah, one of the things in respect to growth is not necessarily just having a great idea around the game. It's also having a legacy of content that you can lean into. Yeah,
and also, if you look at a company like Games Workshop that I've been following since 83, look how they step by step have developed the company. They stayed on a steady path all the time. And I think they've done an incredibly good work on where they are today, both in the miniatures, in the tabletop, in the board games, and obviously in the digital space. And they're still based around Nottingham and the three factories there.
And you mentioned earlier about Minecraft. Obviously, you were part of that early team that got involved in the growth of Minecraft. But if you look at that in regards to player agency, creativity, and curation, a lot of great concepts are being born within that landscape. So, yeah, what would your take be on individual and cultural expression within Minecraft and also the opportunity to grow within that realm.
Yeah, I think it's important to say my contribution was incredibly small, less than 1%, because I was the advisory board, but I was the first guy, I was the first advisor. So what I was impressed with, and I still say that when I do a lot of speeches to universities, the roadmap, the pitch deck from Minecraft when they come back for the second meeting is the best I still see. The way they focus on the game, the very early reach out to the community. They started then later on with merchandising, and then the Minecon have their own events. So they were really focused on what to do. 3 co-founders with very different roles. So I think it was impressive how they stood. And at my time, which wasn't that long, I also tried to shield them from media because the whole world wanted to buy them. There were people flying in all over the world and wanted to invest in Minecraft. So they stay put from this, they put a hold on acquisition targets, which has been from other Swedish companies. You have a few very successful Swedish companies today that's basically been holding out very long before eventually Tencent or somebody else have come and invested in them. So I think that confident and at that early stage, the humble belief on what they're doing with this very strong narrative has been obviously one of the secret sauce.
You've mentioned before in some of our conversations that in respect to your viewpoint on the games industry, it's for the first time it's reaching maturity. I feel the same, and I think that there's further opportunities above and beyond games, and we'll touch upon that in a bit. But just to share, what does that mean for people watching this and listening in practical terms?
I think and it was very clear to me. First, I went to DICE in Vegas in February. Then I went to GDC. I wanted to talk to people in blockchain. I went to talk to Zynga people. I think what I saw was, and not in this order, I think there's a confusion around monetization. And clearly, players stick with their home game much longer. There is a focus clearly to fewer big IPs, which you also saw seen in Hollywood in movies. So the AA, I think, is going to get squeezed. I've been following, for example, the number of concurrent players on Steam, and you see when you have huge investment, how fast they drop. So the appetite to test many games have clearly disappeared. So what I like with the industry today, I'm not a huge fan of everything with AI, but you can basically be a one-man band and create fantastic things. So I would say GTA 6 going to take enormous amount of players and money. I think people probably in the industry underestimated the power of TikTok. I think people still don't realize the power of GTA 6, how much money that's going to take from other releases. So you have a concentration around Fortnite, which is more like a digital life, Lego and Disney hanging their hats more on that platform. So you have GTA, Fortnite, and Roblox. There's been a redistribution of creative power. I actually like this kind of evolution because there were simply just too many games coming out. I think the question marks now is a little bit around monetization. You obviously have the AI thing when it comes to liabilities and what you can do. But I think the industry is going through a very interesting phase. And you also have new countries coming up with the capability with the Unreal, the engines. So you have many other countries coming in and competing into the playing field. The competition is fierce, but on top of that, I think there is still big opportunities for creative independent studios.
And you've said before, especially around Europe, that Europe faces the most headwinds. We look at like studio closures and the risk of capital flight and tightening margins and such. What do you feel needs to change?
If you look at the AAA studios, they had an enormous amount of people investing in hundreds and hundreds of millions in games. So you have a trend today where people are staying longer to the games. You have also the simplest game, which is more relaxing, or odd games that is run by influencers and TikTok. So I think change. I think they're going to be fewer games, and to some degree, they might be fewer players. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because, as we all know, during the COVID, everything propelled and everything was just too much money coming in, too many games. I think now it's a natural evolution, and we're reaching a maturity, and we're going into a very interesting phase. I don't see, let's say, a lot of cross-border between board games and digital. I see in what you also with your interview with Simon also the transmedia, the closeness between the Hollywood studios and gaming. I think that's going to be interesting to see how that evolves, that with The Last of Us. And obviously it's going to be interesting to see what Netflix and those guys are looking into game. Because when Warner Bros. Started more with the games, they were also very successful with Lego, for example, the Lego franchise. So I think we are in for a very interesting phase in the sector, but I still think people are underestimating. They're going to be more cold winds and probably more in Europe.
To chip on the transmedia piece, I think that studios just need to build out more holistically, in my opinion. I think that when we look at opportunities, the biggest opportunities is the interconnection of product. And that isn't necessarily saying, okay, we have a great game that's coming out and therefore we'll deliver a live service on it and we'll provide ongoing DLCs. It's like, that's one part of it. But the opportunity that I'm seeing is, again, like, how do you then cross-pollinate? How do you then draw in audiences from other elements and create, rather than build products, you build ecosystems that falls within that. To go back to board games, one of the things that I bought...
I like your cars in the background there.
Yeah. I love Lego. I get them for Christmas every year. Yeah, I bought this the other day, and I look at things like the detective box that's just come out and think there's so many franchises out there that could be adapting and going down the route of games that draw people out of a digital realm into like a physical experience that they play with one another. I've had Fabian talk about the opportunities and also the risks in and around comics and AI going forward. But you mentioned TikTok earlier. I guess the question is, what do you feel are the next like blind spots that people aren't seeing clearly enough? And also, what would you avoid in regards to that like whole holistic ecosystem build that we just touched upon?
What I feel is that the board game sector, there's not going to be much of a change there, which I think is good. It's going to continue to grow. I would like to see some trade organizations in board games. And there isn't that kind of funding structure with VCs. Or obviously you have private equity with Asmodee's fantastic, successful journey. But I think with board games, I don't see that much change. You clearly see successful IPs like Stardew Valley, Europea Universalis, etc. They have created their board games. So that's one trend. I don't want to talk too much about it, but there are some countries that work more hours than Sweden and France, for example, even if they are super structured countries. So I think we're going to see some surprise countries coming up where you have half of the team remote and half of the team in other countries. I think we're going to see more initiative from Korea and Southeast Asia coming forward. And obviously, we all know this. I think if I would be advising a publisher today or a studio, I would probably say, look extra, what's the difference between China, Korea, and Japan? Because they obviously are huge different in those regions, because Europe and North America have a lot of similarities. But you have to be really smart how you deploy resources today and how you do a little bit of copy or paste in your thought process of developing game. And as you say also about live ops, there is a fatigue around live ops. You've seen that with so many releases. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing.
Yeah, it's true. Like I must admit, I'm a bit bored of the whole live ops, because I look at it, I'm like, so I'm obsessed with storytelling, and to me, storytelling has to evolve and it has to move away from that whole episodic viewpoint whereby they don't have to interrelate to one another. And it's just, we've got another map, we've got some more characters. People want more depth of narrative, not more products being pumped out there. And if it interconnects, again, you create more of a compelling narrative that you could then cross-pollinate to other realms. And if you focus more upon the storytelling and the quality of the execution, you don't really fail. But ultimately, if you focus solely on almost being reactive to what a community may feel like they desire, then I think in larger realms, you're focusing more on a niche community rather than the wider opportunity of a whole holistic community when it looks like the premise of entertainment rather than just productization. That's my view. And also, you're right in what you say about places like China, because the hours that people work there just equates to the ability to build out more in a shorter space of time. I'm not saying that's correct or that's wrong. It's just also an appreciation of a different model. And when you look at the retreat of Chinese capital, historically, we've seen a lot of investment, such as in, if you look at Ubisoft, for example, Tencent's percentage share of Ubisoft. If that capital retreats, then it has implications on what those companies may do going forward. So I guess the question being is, looking at some of these global shifts as well, I know you touched upon some a little earlier, but maybe a little bit more depth. Like, should you be advising global leaders now. What do you feel that they should be watching most clearly right now?
You can see that the top guys, even like Krafton, that they are obviously focusing inwards as well, because they have so much good things happen in their domestic region with PUBG and that game. I think esport, which I've been skeptical for many years, I think that's going to come closer with some good initiative around World Cup. There is a company which I'm currently advising a little bit called Sparta, which is brand new, which is more like play competition gaming, which also means that there could be new revenue stream for publishers. So I think a studio are thinking, are we going to do publisher or are we going to do self-publishing? And then I think the studios are thinking, can we do all global, or should we have some specific specialist in some other APAC regions, for example? But I think it's more the big guys, they probably know what to do. And I think we're clearly going to see also a little bit more of outsourcing, fewer smaller studios, more outsourcing, because as there's been a lot of the work for hire. You had the keyword acquisition, for example. You have a lot of activities around the work for hire sector. So I think we are in for a very interesting time in the industry moving forward. I think the dependency on some events in North America is going to reduce for various reasons. And I think there are opportunities for new meet and greet. Gamescom, I think, is going to be very important in a few weeks' time. And in board games, you have SN, which is always fully booked in October.
So one of the things that I've always looked at with regards to some of these like conferences and events that come together, where do you think the benefit lies? Do you think the benefit lies in a lot of people coming together to talk holistically about some of the games that are coming out? Or do you think there's more of an opportunity to have more focused sessions, like smaller groups, smaller collaborations especially between indies, to help grow and nurture that part of the sector? Because taking experience from the Nordic Gamescom that we both attended a month or so ago, there was a lot of good there, but then equally, I don't know, I just felt regards to expansion, it could have had a little bit more focus, but I don't know. What would your take be in regards to the current model that we see when it comes to industry events?
I think we're going to see a change. I mean, in DICE, for example, you have smaller focus meeting. I think GDC is going to struggle with international attendance for obvious reasons. I think the event like Nordic Games could be also more reaching out to, for example, to European studios and UK studios. I think that's an area which clearly can grow. But as you said earlier, I think smaller round table groups. You have companies, for example, in UK, you have Goodbody, for example, who has an industry event. You have Vigins that has an industry event. You have when you collect 100 people. I find those events very fruitful. And I'm lucky to be invited to these kind of events. And I think that's another thing where I think UK is probably leading the pack of that kind of focused niche events. And we're probably going to see new type of events or round tables, because the indie developers also need to find a way to reach out to each other. But if you look in Sweden, for example, I've been in a place called Game Town, which is like a work for hire, a lot of small companies together. And I'm amazed to see how the indies connect with each other, because obviously they don't use like platforms like LinkedIn, and they have other tools. You have Discord, etc. So we're going to see a change in how people connect for sure, both from a geographical, political situation in the world today because of the need of the industry.
What kind of companies draw on your gaze at the moment in respect to the wider realm of entertainment? Because one of the points that I've always been intrigued upon, especially, I know he's left now, but obviously Mike Verdu went over to Netflix and Leanne Loeb was there for a bit. Both have subsequently left. But like, I was reading an article the other day, actually, I think, about Netflix doubling down on gaming in regards to, well, driven obviously by the successes that they're seeing thus far in some of their own games that they've gone and published, and the rise of franchise such as like Squid Games and the intrigue in and around that. So I'm really personally enamored by and like to keep a close focus on Netflix, because I do think that as a platform, especially with the user base, it's so huge that if they get their ducks in order per se, there is a huge opportunity for further expansion, not just into the games that we see, but also the ability to go down that transmedia route between series, movies, TV and such, and also how games are developed and brought to market. So again, I'm really a big fan of Netflix, but which companies in that kind of realm, similar model per se, are drawing your gaze at the moment, and why?
I've been looking more into what are Hasbro doing with Wizard of the Coast, What's Axis and Allies is a board game coming out where Hasbro have outsourced it to another. I think maybe Rebellion. I have to check that. But I've been looking more around what's happening under the surface. How is Games Workshop looking into the franchises or licensing of the game? What are Lego doing? Lego had some new people coming on board. So that's where I am. I think with the Netflix and Apple and EA, they are better people than me that are closer to answer that one. I think Netflix has always been interesting because, as we said earlier, maybe 30 minutes ago, Sweden was the first international country where they launched Q4 2012. So they always been testing, and I think they've been quite tactful how they have approached the industry. I think what we know today, there are so many subscription services everywhere. That is where the maturity have reached. And I'm not answering your question now, but I probably forgot to say that if you look into the years of, let's say, 2007, 2010, you basically had the iPhone, you have the Steam, you have the Xbox 360. I think I said Apple TV. You had Amazon UK coming in huge into the UK market. You had so many changes in the industry. And I think what's happening the last 2 years is that we face again so many different changes in the industry. What is Apple going to do, for example? And I think that's interesting. I've been a little bit skeptical when you look into the big toy companies, how they have approaching. And I think they're getting there. I think they're starting to do a very good job now. So that I find very interesting.
I wanted to close out with a few things. Obviously, in the previous few episodes, we've been focusing a lot on transmedia. So in that respect, what's your favorite game, favorite series, and favorite movie that you're drawn to right now? And also, if you were to place one bet on gaming's next frontier per se, where would that be?
The Last of Us, I think, was amazing if you look into the game and the TV series. And for example, I loved Game of Thrones when I was coming into Warner Bros. But Game of Thrones had a bumpy ride into digital. So I think from that point of view, I think The Last of Us is good. I'm a little bit allergic to some of the new TV series. If there are too much AI fake, I like the old storytelling things. I think when it comes to games nowadays, I'm more like a simpler game, very easy games. And I'm embarrassed to say maybe board games, I'm sometimes more like Ticket to Ride and so on. Yeah. But The Last of Us, I think it's a fantastic success story.
The last question I like to ask everybody is, what would your key thought and takeaway be that you'd like to leave your audience?
I think it's just stay curious. And the good thing with all the digital transformation, networking is key, like the way you and I met. And I started very early to travel. And I think despite all the digital, go out and meet new people, the networking is really key to the business. I think also one thing I also keeping an eye on now is it was 1 year since they launched Star Wars Unlimited, like a trading card game. Because if you look into the profit of the big board game companies, even Asmodee, there is a lot of trading card games, and you have Magic the Gathering, etc. What can the Star Wars franchise do in the next couple of 2 years? Because obviously the card game has been a success. We've seen some, I think you talked with Simon about that, some fatigue on other brands, which I probably avoid to say here so I don't cause any media bump on that one. But the Hollywood studios, I kept a track on them, probably from another angle than Simon. Is more, what are the number of releases they're doing now? How are they thinking on the big screen? That I find very interesting, and how are that looping into the transmedia, into new games, of course.
Man, it's always a pleasure chatting to you. So yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Pete. I really enjoyed this.